"Step out of the car now," Officer Jake Miller barked, his voice slicing through the rainy Chicago night. Michael Carter, a federal judge in his 50s, stood tall in his dark tailored suit, his blind German Shepherd Valor pressing close at his side. Within seconds, Miller shoved him against the sleek Cadillac, metal cuffs glinting under the streetlights as bystanders froze, their phones rising to capture what looked like a man's dignity being stripped away on the curb. Chicago wore a gray cloak that evening. The clouds hung low over the city, swollen with rain, and the streets shimmered under the glow of yellow street lamps, their reflections broken by ripples of drizzle. It was late October, the kind of night when the air smelled of wet asphalt and faint smoke from chimneys in the suburbs. Against that backdrop, a black Cadillac CT6 glided smoothly down Lakeshore Drive, its headlights carving clean paths through sheets of mist. Inside sat a man whose calm exterior masked the weight of decades spent in the service of justice. Michael Carter, 52 years old, was not the kind of man who wore his authority on his sleeve, yet it emanated from him all the same. He was tall, with a lean, athletic build that age had not dulled, though his posture spoke of long nights spent over legal briefs and years of disciplined restraint. His hair was salt and pepper, cropped short, and the fine lines around his dark brown eyes hinted at both wisdom and weariness. A faint scar crossed his jawline, nearly invisible unless the light hit just right, a relic from his early career as a prosecutor when he had received a death threat that turned violent outside a courthouse parking lot. That night, long ago, had hardened his resolve. Now, as a federal judge in Chicago, his reputation was that of an incorruptible man, even-tempered, analytical, with a voice steady enough to calm or cut through any courtroom storm. His clothing reflected that composure, a navy blue tailored suit, crisp white shirt, and a muted gray tie, an ensemble that was both professional and understated. Yet tonight, he was not just a judge. He was a husband and a father, rushing through the rain to reach a community center on the city's south side, where he had agreed to speak quietly, anonymously, about police reform. His mind lingered on the gravity of the task ahead, but in the back seat of the Cadillac, a steady presence reminded him of another duty altogether. Valor, his German Shepherd, rested there. The dog was 9 years old, his once sharp eyes now clouded with blindness. Across his face was a white cloth band tied neatly, both to protect the sockets from irritation and to spare strangers the discomfort of staring too long. Yet, blindness had not broken Valor's spirit. His ears remained high and alert, his breathing measured, and his nose twitched as he absorbed the sense of the rain-soaked city with extraordinary precision. His fur was thick, still bearing the noble blend of sable and black that German Shepherds were known for, though streaks of gray around his muzzle told of his years of service. Once, Valor had been part of a search and rescue unit. In his prime, he had leapt into burning buildings, tracked missing children through forests, and even once saved an elderly woman from a collapsed basement during a tornado in Indiana. It was in that same tornado, amid falling debris and smoke, that Valor lost his sight to shattering glass. Retirement might have been the end, but Michael adopted him shortly after, seeing in the dog a resilience that mirrored his own. For Michael, Valor was more than a companion. He was a symbol of enduring strength in the face of brokenness. The Cadillac's wipers beat rhythmically as Michael maneuvered through traffic. He glanced once in the rearview mirror, not to check the road, but to look at Valor, who lifted his nose slightly as if sensing his master's attention. "We'll be back before they know it," Michael murmured softly. "I promised Emily I wouldn't miss it this time." His deep baritone voice carried both tenderness and the faint gravity of an oath. Far across town, in a warm suburban home lined with ivy and golden maple trees, Emily Carter sat in her bedroom, surrounded by sheet music. 17 years old, she was tall and slender, her long curls of dark hair often falling over her freckled face as she practiced. The violin rested on her lap, its polished wood catching the light from a desk lamp. Emily's fingers trembled as she plucked the strings, her heart racing with the thought of the recital scheduled for the next evening. Emily had inherited her father's discipline and her mother's sharp wit, but unlike them, she carried a streak of youthful uncertainty. Ever since she was a child, she had dreamed of playing before a large audience, but as the day drew near, her nerves became storms. Tonight, the The strings refused to obey her. She played a passage from Vivaldi, but the bows screeched instead of singing, and frustration welled up until tears blurred her sight. With a sharp tug, the E string snapped, the sound of its break slicing the silence like glass. Emily dropped the bow and buried her face in her hands. Her mother, Laura Carter, appeared in the doorway almost instantly, as if she had been waiting for that very moment. Laura was 50 years old, still graceful in the way she carried herself. She was tall and slender, with shoulder-length auburn hair often pinned back when she lectured at the university, where she was a professor of literature. Laura had the kind of presence that drew people into conversation, warm eyes, a soft smile, but also a subtle steeliness born of her own struggles. Years earlier, she had survived breast cancer, and though the battle had left faint scars on her body, it had forged in her a resilience that touched everything she did. Tonight, she leaned against the doorframe, arms folded lightly, watching her daughter with the patience of a woman who had learned to endure storms. "Strings break," Laura said gently, her voice a soothing counterpoint to Emily's sobs. "You don't." Emily looked up, cheeks flushed, eyes red. "Mom, I can't do this. What if I fail tomorrow? What if everyone's watching and I—" Laura crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter, brushing a curl away from her damp cheek. "You won't fail. You've been preparing for this moment for years. Do you remember what I told you after your first recital, when you were 10? Emily sniffled. That I sounded like a cat crying? Laura laughed softly, shaking her head. No, I said that even if you had sounded like that, I would still be proud of you, because courage matters more than perfection. Emily leaned against her mother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and old books. What if Dad doesn't make it back in time? She whispered. He missed my last performance because of court. Laura tightened her embrace. He promised this time, and you know your father doesn't break promises easily. At that very moment, the phone on Emily's desk buzzed. Laura reached for it, smiling as she saw Michael's name on the screen. She handed it to Emily. Hey, sweetheart, Michael's voice came through the speaker, warm despite the distant hum of rain in the background. I'm on my way downtown for the meeting, but I'll be home right after. I wouldn't miss tomorrow for the world. Emily hesitated, her throat tight. You really mean it? I do, Michael said firmly. I'll be in the front row, with Mom and Valor by my side, clapping the loudest. That's a promise, Valor, in the back seat of the Cadillac, lifted his head as if in agreement, his ears twitching at the sound of Michael's voice softening. For a moment, silence filled the line, broken only by the faint rumble of thunder outside Emily's window. Then she said, almost inaudibly, Okay, I believe you. Laura took the phone, thanked her husband, and after a few soft words of goodnight, ended the call. She placed it back on the desk and kissed Emily's forehead. Get some sleep, darling. Tomorrow will be beautiful. Emily nodded, though worry still flickered in her eyes. She tightened the blanket around her shoulders and stared at the violin case across the room. Somewhere deep inside, she wanted to believe her mother and father both, wanted to trust that the world could, for once, keep its promises. Meanwhile, Michael drove deeper into the city, past blocks where neon lights flickered and rainwater gathered in storm drains like small rivers. Valor shifted in the back seat, ears pricked. The judge tapped the steering wheel rhythmically, a habit when he was lost in thought. His mind oscillated between legal reforms and his daughter's trembling voice. For all his years of weighing evidence and passing judgment, it was Emily's wavering faith in him that felt like the heaviest case he had ever been handed. Outside, the rain thickened. Chicago breathed under the storm, a city of resilience, its skyline blurred but still standing tall. Inside the Cadillac, a man, his blind dog, and a promise carried the weight of both family and justice into the uncertain night. Rain continued to fall in heavy curtains over Chicago, its rhythm tapping against windows and pooling along curbs like silver rivers. Michael Carter's Cadillac rolled steadily through the slick streets, the hum of the engine a steady counterpoint to the storm. Valor, his blind German shepherd, shifted in the back seat, ears twitching at every passing sound, nostrils flaring with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt, oil, and distant food stalls. Michael tapped the steering wheel lightly with his index finger, not to any song but in silent thought, replaying his promise to Emily in his mind. "I'll be in the front row." The words weighed heavier than any gavel he had ever raised. Several blocks away, Officer Jake Miller guided his patrol car slowly along South Michigan Avenue. Miller was 36 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his sandy blonde hair cropped close but untidy, as though he cared little for appearances. His eyes, a pale blue, often carried a narrowed suspicion that rarely softened, not even when he smiled. His jawline was perpetually clenched, a tic developed over years of self-inflicted tension. Once considered a promising recruit, Miller had lost his father, a decorated officer, to a gunfight when Jake was 12. That night had carved a permanent mark into his psyche, an unshakable conviction that crime lurked in every shadow, and more dangerously, a belief that certain kinds of people were always the ones carrying it. Though commendations once decorated his file, complaints followed in equal measure: excessive force, verbal abuse, unwarranted searches. None had stuck. Miller carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed he was untouchable. Tonight, the storm only sharpened his edge. He scanned passing cars with an intensity bordering on hostility, until his gaze locked on the Cadillac CT6 gliding effortlessly through the wet street. Expensive, immaculate, driven by a man whose dark complexion lit a fuse in the officer's prejudiced mind. Miller's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. He flipped on his lights, red and blue piercing through the rain. Michael's eyes flicked to the mirror, calm but alert. Valor stirred, lifting his head, a low growl escaping his throat, as if the dog sensed the change in atmosphere. Michael slowed, pulled to the side, and rolled the window halfway as the rain hissed around them. He reached calmly for his wallet, already knowing what was coming. Miller approached with deliberate slowness, shoulders squared, boots splashing through puddles. He leaned down to the window, his voice sharp and commanding. "License and registration." Michael handed both documents over without hesitation, his expression composed. "Of course, officer." "Is there a problem?" Miller's eyes scanned the papers, then flicked back to Michael with exaggerated suspicion. "This your car?" "It is," Michael replied evenly. "Purchased 5 years ago, fully paid." The officer's pale eyes narrowed further. "Step out of the vehicle." In the back seat, Valor rose onto his paws, his frame tense, emitting a growl deeper than before. The dog's blind gaze was covered by his white cloth, yet his presence was menacing, a silent protector unbothered by his lack of sight. Miller stepped back instinctively at the sound, his hand twitching toward his belt before settling again. Another door opened. Officer Daniel Harris, Miller's partner, emerged from the patrol car. Harris was 28, slender with short brown hair neatly combed, his youthful face framed by wire-rimmed glasses that fogged slightly in the rain. Unlike Miller, Harris had joined the force with ideals intact. He carried himself with an air of politeness and uncertainty, as though still reconciling the academy's teachings with the messy truths of the street. Harris's upbringing had been modest, his mother a nurse, his father a mail carrier, and he had grown up believing fairness was a virtue worth fighting for. But standing beside Miller often tested that conviction. Harris approached the Cadillac cautiously, his voice softer than his partner's. "Evening, sir." Just a routine stop. His eyes flicked briefly to Valor, who remained tense but silent now, sensing Michael's steadying hand. Michael stepped out of the vehicle as instructed, straightening his navy suit jacket. The rain clung to his shoulders, droplets running down his salt and pepper hair. He held himself with dignity, even as Miller loomed closer. "Officer," Michael said, voice calm, "I assure you everything is in order." "You've seen my documents?" Miller's reply was a sharp bark. "We'll see about that." Hands on the car, Daniel Harris shifted uneasily. His gaze moved from Miller's tightened jaw to Michael's composed demeanor, then to the watchful crowd beginning to notice the flashing lights. A young couple under an umbrella paused nearby, whispering. A busboy stepping out from a diner lit a cigarette and glanced over curiously. Harris felt his stomach twist. Something about this wasn't right. Back at the Carter household, the storm rapped harder against the windows. Emily sat again at her desk, now restringing her violin with trembling fingers. Her hands shook not just from frustration, but from a gnawing unease she couldn't name. She tried to play a scale, but the bow slipped, producing a screech that made her wince. The sound echoed her anxiety. Laura entered quietly, carrying a steaming mug of chamomile tea. She set it beside Emily with a small smile. "For the nerves," she said. Her auburn hair was tied in a loose bun, and though her eyes radiated warmth, they also carried shadows from years of struggle. "Try again," she urged gently. Emily shook her head. "It feels wrong tonight, like something bad is going to happen." Laura knelt, pulling Emily into her arms. "You're not alone in this, Em. Your father will be here tomorrow." He promised, Emily whispered. "But what if—" "No what ifs," Laura interrupted softly. "Your music is bigger than your fear." She pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, though behind her own calm words, she too felt the weight of an unshakable worry. On the wet Chicago street, Michael stood calmly as Miller circled him like a predator. The rain dripped from the brim of Miller's cap, his pale eyes burning with unearned authority. Harris remained a step behind, his unease growing as he watched Valor plant himself at the open door of the Cadillac, body taut, as though ready to leap despite his blindness. The crowd of onlookers thickened slightly, their murmurs blending with the storm. "Everything is in order," Michael repeated, voice firm but respectful. "I've cooperated fully." Miller leaned close, his tone laced with hostility. "People like you think a nice suit makes you untouchable." Valor growled again, low and steady, the sound vibrating through the damp air. Harris's chest tightened, every instinct screaming that this encounter was spiraling towards something ugly. The storm outside mirrored the storm gathering on that sidewalk, a collision of prejudice, restraint, suspicion, and dignity. The drizzle turned into heavy rain, drumming against car hoods and echoing in gutters, as the moment stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. And in a quiet house across town, Emily clutched her violin tighter, her mother's arms around her, both whispering faith against the nameless fear. The storm had thickened into a curtain of water that blurred the streetlights into pale halos. Rain hissed off the hood of the Cadillac, bouncing in rivulets that streamed toward the gutter. Michael Carter stood beside his car, his navy suit jacket now drenched, but his composure remained unbroken. Valor, his blind German shepherd, stayed at the open door, body tense, ears pricked, as though every drop of rain carried meaning. Officer Jake Miller prowled like a predator, circling its prey. The sneer on his lips was more than suspicion. It was performance, meant for the growing crowd now huddling under umbrellas and phone cameras. Miller's hand drifted to his utility belt, fingers brushing against a small plastic bag filled with white powder, a prop he had carried many times before, hidden like a magician's trick. His pale eyes flicked toward Harris briefly, then back to Michael with predatory delight. Michael's voice, calm and resonant, cut through the rain. "Officer, you have my documents? You've searched me. What else are you hoping to find?" Miller grinned sharply, leaning closer. "The truth always shows itself." He crouched near the open driver's seat, the small bag palmed discreetly. Daniel Harris, standing nearby, felt his pulse quicken. His rain-slick glasses blurred his view, but his instinct screamed that something wasn't right. Harris was young, but not naive. He had heard whispers in the precinct, rumors of Miller's lucky breaks on drug busts, the uncanny way evidence always appeared when Miller was involved. Tonight, with the cameras of civilians already pointed, Harris felt the weight of his badge like a stone pressing down. Miller slid his hand beneath the seat, his body shielding the motion from most angles. But Valor's nose twitched. Even blind, the shepherd's instincts were razor sharp. The faint chemical tang of the powder, so different from the wet concrete and Michael's familiar scent, triggered the dog's warning. With a guttural bark that thundered louder than the storm, Valor lunged forward, his head knocking Miller's arm. The bag slipped from Miller's grip, tumbling onto the slick pavement. The clear plastic glistened under the streetlight just as a young woman raised her phone higher. Her name was Alicia Morgan, 22 years old, a college journalism student who had ducked under a storefront awning to avoid the rain. Alicia had been filming the entire encounter, her eyes wide behind round glasses. She was petite, with short curly hair that clung wetly to her cheeks, And though she had once been shy about confrontation, years of watching her older brother mistreated by police had carved a quiet defiance into her. She gasped audibly as the bag landed almost at her feet, recording every second. Harris's body camera caught it too, the lens angled perfectly as Miller jerked backward in shock. The crowd's murmurs swelled into shouts. "Did you see that?" one man exclaimed. "He dropped it himself." Miller's face hardened, pale blue eyes flashing with panic before rage swallowed it. He snatched the bag up quickly, holding it aloft as if nothing had happened. Well, what do we have here?" His voice boomed theatrically. "Cocaine!" "Felony possession." Michael remained steady, rain dripping from his hair, his eyes fixed on Miller with an intensity that carried both sorrow and strength. "That substance is not mine," he said, his baritone firm and deliberate. He turned his head toward the crowd, then to Harris. "You all know where it came from. The truth cannot be hidden." The words landed heavily. Harris's throat tightened. His conscience pulled him in one direction, while Miller's domineering presence pushed the other. The young officer shifted his weight, rain running down his jawline as he adjusted his glasses, silently battling himself. Valor pressed closer to Michael's side, barking once more, his body angled toward Miller as though he could see through the storm of deceit. The blind dog stood like a sentinel, his white cloth band catching the glow of headlights, a beacon in the darkened street. Across town, in the warm Carter household, Emily sat cross-legged on her bed, phone in hand. She dialed her father again, her finger trembling against the glass screen. 1 ring, 2, 3, straight to voicemail. Her chest tightened. She tried again, pressing harder this time, as if urgency alone could connect the call. Still nothing. Laura entered quietly, holding a folded blanket. She saw the panic in her daughter's eyes and forced her own face into calm. "Maybe he's still at the meeting," she said softly, though her own stomach twisted with unease. She sat beside Emily, pulling her into an embrace. The rain outside their window beat like anxious fingers on the glass, a relentless reminder of the storm across the city. Emily whispered, "What if something happened?" "I feel it, Mom. Something's wrong." Laura smoothed her daughter's curls, her voice measured. "Your father's strong. He's faced storms far greater than this. He'll come home." But even as she said it, her gaze flicked toward the clock on the wall. The hands ticked past 9, each second heavy with unspoken fear. Back on the street, Alicia Morgan adjusted her grip on her phone, recording every frame. Her journalism professor's words echoed in her memory. The truth needs witnesses willing to hold the line. She held the phone higher, her heart pounding, certain this was bigger than anything she had ever captured before. Michael straightened, shoulders square despite the rain plastering his suit to his frame. His voice carried above the storm, directed not at Miller, but at the witnesses around them. "Record everything. Remember what you saw. Justice is not for those with power alone. It is for everyone." The crowd erupted with voices, some outraged, some fearful, all charged with, the electricity of revelation. Harris looked from Miller to the bag in his partner's hand, then to Michael's unwavering stance. The weight of the moment pressed on him like thunderclouds overhead, and he realized he stood at a crossroads, not just for his career, but for his soul. Miller barked at the crowd, "Step back! Interference will lead to arrest." But the authority in his voice no longer rang unquestioned. The evidence had slipped, literally, from his hands into the world's view, and Valor, the blind dog with unseeing eyes, had ensured the truth would not be buried in shadows. The storm raged on, but beneath its roar, something greater stirred. The first crack in the facade of unchecked power, split open by a dog who could not see, but who sensed more clearly than anyone. Rain followed the patrol car like a shadow, its wipers swiping furiously across the windshield as the city blurred by. Michael Carter sat in the back seat, his wrists bound in cold cuffs that pressed against his skin. The leather of the Cadillac had been exchanged for the hard plastic of the cruiser's interior, yet Michael's expression remained steady, his posture upright. Valor, permitted to ride with him after persistent protest, lay across the seat beside him, the blind dog's head resting on Michael's knee, his body a silent anchor. The white cloth over Valor's eyes was soaked through, but his presence radiated calm strength. In the driver's seat, Jake Miller whistled a tuneless note, smugness written across his face. His blonde hair, damp from the rain, stuck to his forehead. He imagined the commendations, the recognition, the story he would spin. Another criminal off the streets. He thrived on the theater of it all, and tonight he was convinced he had delivered his finest performance. Next to him, Daniel Harris sat stiffly, hands tight on his knees. His body camera weighed on him more heavily than his vest. His mind replayed the moment again and again. The slip, the bark, the bag falling, the phones rising. He knew what he had seen, and the truth was carved into the footage he carried. Yet beside him sat Miller, his superior, radiating arrogance. Harris's stomach churned with dread, but also with something stronger. Resolve. When they pulled into the 5th Precinct station, the rain eased into a drizzle, though the sky remained a dark slate. The fluorescent lights of the station buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow on the cracked pavement outside. A desk sergeant greeted them with tired eyes. Sergeant Robert Whitaker was in his late 50s, with a weathered face and thinning gray hair. His broad frame had softened over the years, but his eyes still carried the sharpness of a man who had seen too much. Whitaker had a reputation for quiet fairness, though cynicism had settled into his bones after decades of watching good officers break and bad officers rise. "Got ourselves a drug possession and attempted vehicle theft," Miller announced loudly, dragging Michael through the door as though parading a trophy. Valor padded silently at Michael's side, tail still, head high. Whitaker frowned, his gaze lingering on Michael's dignified bearing. Something about the man did not align with Miller's crude summary. "What's his name?" the sergeant asked flatly. Miller shoved a wet driver's license across the counter. "Carter." Michael Carter Whitaker examined it, the weight of recognition dawning slowly. His eyes flicked from the laminated card to Michael's face. He had seen that name before, read it in newspapers, heard it whispered in judicial briefings. A chill crept into his chest. "Put him in interview room 2, Whitaker said quietly, concealing the tremor in his voice. He turned sharply to Harris. "Paperwork now." Inside the Stark interview room, Michael sat calmly, cuffs still binding his wrists. Valor curled at his feet, the dogs breathing steady. The white cloth over Valor's eyes gave him an almost ethereal presence, like a guardian misplaced among steel chairs and buzzing lights. Michael raised his chin, meeting the gaze of each officer who passed the small window. There was no fear in him, only patience. Harris slipped away to the tech office, his hands trembling as he removed the body camera from his vest. The technician on duty was Officer Lillian Price, a woman in her early 40s with close-cropped black hair and sharp cheekbones. She was quiet, methodical, and had built a reputation for integrity. A decade earlier, her younger brother had been falsely arrested in a case that collapsed when video evidence exonerated him. Since then, Price had dedicated her career to ensuring no piece of footage was ever overlooked. "What have you got, Harris?" she asked, her eyes narrowing at his pallor. He handed her the device without a word. She loaded the footage, and the room filled with sound, the storm, the bark, the thud of plastic on wet pavement. Then Miller's triumphant voice. Price froze, her mouth tightening into a grim line. "You need to show this to Whitaker," she said, her voice flat with urgency. Meanwhile, Laura Carter's phone vibrated on the nightstand back home. She picked it up, expecting a message from Michael. Instead, it was a neighbor who had seen a video circulating on social media, grainy but clear enough to show Michael surrounded by flashing lights. Laura's heart dropped. Emily, still clutching her violin case, looked up at her mother's pale face. "What happened?" Emily whispered. Laura didn't answer immediately. She grabbed her coat, slipped her arms through with shaking urgency. "We're going to the precinct," she said. Emily hugged the violin to her chest, her knuckles white against the case. She trembled, but lifted her chin with sudden fierceness. "Tomorrow, I'll play, and Dad will be there." At the precinct, Sergeant Whitaker called Miller into his office, Harris standing silently behind him. Whitaker's office was cluttered with paper stacks, and an American flag faded from years of sunlight. Miller swaggered in, arms crossed, ready for congratulations. But Whitaker's face was stone. "Sit," Whitaker ordered. Miller frowned but complied. Harris stepped forward, placing the footage on the desk. Whitaker played it. The sounds filled the small room. The growl, the bark, the slip, the bag falling. The silence that followed was thunderous. Miller's face paled, but his jaw clenched. "That doesn't prove anything." Could have been as Whitaker's voice was steel. "That man you dragged in here is Judge Michael Carter. Federal. You planted evidence on a federal judge." The words dropped like a gavel. Miller's bravado cracked, his eyes, darting to Harris, then back to Whitaker. "That's impossible! Enough!" Whitaker snapped. "Badge and gun." Now, the order rang through the precinct like a shockwave. Officers nearby glanced toward the office, whispers rippling. Harris felt his chest loosen for the first time all night. In interview room 2, Michael lifted his head as the door opened. Whitaker entered with solemn respect. He nodded to the cuffs, and another officer quickly removed them. "Judge Carter," Whitaker said, his voice low, "on behalf of this precinct, I apologize." Michael rubbed his wrist slowly, standing tall once more. "Apologies are words," he said gently. "Truth is action." Valor rose beside him, pressing his body against Michael's leg as if affirming the statement. Moments later, Laura and Emily arrived, soaked from the rain. Emily's violin case clutched in her arms looked far too heavy for her young frame. When she saw her father freed, she ran forward, nearly colliding with Valor. She threw her arms around Michael's waist. "You're here," she whispered, voice trembling. "You'll come tomorrow, right?" Michael rested his hand on her shoulder, his eyes softening for the first time that night. "I promised, didn't I?" The precinct buzzed with chaos, Miller's suspension echoing through its halls. But within that small reunion, a different kind of order reigned, dignity reclaimed, faith restored. The hunter had stumbled into his own trap, and the truth had begun to rise. The morning after the storm broke with a gentler light, as though the city itself sought to cleanse away the grime of the night before. The air in Chicago smelled faintly of wet concrete and freshly washed leaves, the storm's anger replaced with a quiet clarity. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had already gathered, journalists adjusting cameras, citizens murmuring in tense anticipation. Inside, the halls buzzed with energy. Officers, clerks, and reporters all knew this was no ordinary proceeding. In a holding room, Jake Miller sat slumped in a chair, his blonde hair unkempt, his uniform stripped away and replaced by plain civilian clothes. His arrogance of the night before had collapsed into hollow-eyed defiance. He looked smaller now, shoulders hunched, fists tight against his knees. His lawyer, Richard Dempsey, a wiry man in his late 40s with sharp cheekbones and graying temples, leaned close to him. Dempsey was known in the city as relentless in defending clients, but behind his angular glasses, his eyes carried the fatigue of too many lost causes. He whispered harshly, "They have video, Jake. Multiple angles, body cam, civilians, even your partners. There's no spinning," this Miller muttered under his breath, but his voice lacked conviction. His world had shrunk from the open streets to a narrow hallway of consequences. Across the courthouse, Michael Carter stood before a mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie. He wore a dark suit freshly pressed, his silver-streaked hair combed back. He had always carried himself with dignity, but this morning there was something more, an aura of quiet strength forged in fire. Beside him, Valor sat upright, the blind shepherd's ears alert, his white cloth band clean and dry once more. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the day, tail still, body poised as though standing guard over his master's resolve. Laura Carter entered, her auburn hair pinned back neatly, eyes shadowed from a sleepless night, but glowing with pride. She reached to adjust her husband's cufflink, a simple gesture that said more than words. Emily stood close behind her, her violin case in hand. She wore a pale blue dress that brushed her knees, her curls falling loose around her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes, dark and determined, burned with a clarity beyond her 17 years. "Are you ready, Dad?" Emily asked, her voice quiet but steady. Michael smiled faintly. "I've been ready for this all my life." In the courtroom, the atmosphere grew electric as the proceedings began. Judge Eleanor Daniels presided over the bench, a tall, lean woman in her early 60s with piercing gray eyes and silver hair cut short. She had earned her reputation as one of the most uncompromising judges in the Midwest, shaped in part by her own history. Her father had been a civil rights activist rights attorney in the 1960s, and she had grown up watching him fight impossible battles with relentless conviction. That legacy of justice had become her compass. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room stood as Daniels entered. She surveyed the space with measured calm before settling into her chair. The charges against Miller were read aloud: evidence tampering, false arrest, civil rights violations. Each word rang like a nail into the coffin of his former career. Harris was called to testify, his youthful face pale but resolute. He described the events of the night, his voice steady, though the weight of speaking against a fellow officer pressed heavily on him. Still, he did not falter. His account matched the footage, and when the video was played on screens for the court, a murmur rippled through the gallery. Anger, disbelief, sorrow, all mingling. When it was Michael's turn to address the court, he stepped forward with calm grace. Valor padded beside him, lying down quietly at the podium's base, his white cloth glinting under the lights like a flag of truth. Michael's baritone voice carried across the room, even and unwavering. "Justice," he began, "is not reserved for titles, uniforms, or positions of power. Justice belongs to the dignity of every human being. Last night, I was not a judge to the man who arrested me. I was only a black man behind the wheel of a car, and that alone, in his eyes, was enough to condemn me." The room hushed into silence. "But truth has its own guardians," he continued, glancing down at Valor, then toward Harris. "It may be delayed, it may be bruised, but it cannot be erased. My hope is that we remember justice is not measured by who we protect with it, but by whether we grant it equally to all." The words lingered long after he stepped back. Even Judge Daniels allowed the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement of their weight. Later, as Miller was formally indicted and led away, the courthouse steps filled with reporters. Michael, flanked by Laura, Emily, and Valor, spoke briefly before the cameras. "This is not a victory for me alone," he said. "This is a call for all of us, to remember that truth belongs to everyone, and prejudice diminishes us all." His words traveled quickly across networks, reaching households far beyond Chicago. The following evening, the family gathered in the auditorium of Emily's school. The hall was warm, filled with students in formal attire, teachers bustling, and parents seated in rows. The scent of polished wood and fresh flowers lingered in the air. Michael and Laura took their places in the front row, Valor lying at their feet, his head resting on his paws. When Emily's turn came, she stepped onto the stage, her violin glinting under the lights. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes scanning the audience until they locked on her father's. He gave the smallest nod. Valor barked once, soft but affirming, as though urging her forward. Emily lifted her bow. The first note rose clear and strong, swelling through the hall like light, piercing a shadow. The piece was a classical arrangement she had struggled with for weeks, yet tonight every note carried power. Her fingers moved with new certainty, each sound echoing not only her skill, but her conviction. The audience listened in rapt silence, the melody weaving sorrow, defiance, and triumph together into something greater. When the final note hung in the air, the hall erupted in applause. Michael rose to his feet, Laura wiping tears from her eyes, Valor barking in joyous approval. Emily bowed, her cheeks flushed, her eyes glistening. For her, the performance was more than music. It was a declaration that the darkness had passed, and her family, once threatened, now stood whole. The night closed with laughter, embraces, and the quiet certainty that while storms may come, truth and love endure. In that auditorium, with music still echoing in their hearts, the Carters found both justice and peace. In the end, what seemed like a night of humiliation became a moment of revelation. Justice was not only restored by laws and courts, but also by the courage to stand firm, by the loyalty of a blind shepherd dog, and by the faith that truth will rise no matter how heavy the darkness. Some may call it chance, but those who believe know that it was God's hand guiding each step, turning a trap into a testimony and pain into purpose. In our daily lives, we too face moments where injustice, prejudice, or despair seem stronger than hope. Yet just as Michael's dignity was preserved, and just as Emily's music rose above the storm, God gives us strength to endure, to speak truth, and to shine light in the shadows. The miracle is not always thunder and fire. Sometimes it is as simple as a dog's bark at the right moment, a daughter's song, or the calm voice that refuses to bow to hate. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it so others may remember that miracles still live among us. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to join us for more stories of justice and hope. And if you believe that God protects those who stand for truth, write Amen in the comments. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace, courage, and the unwavering promise that His justice never fails.